Hi folks, welcome back to Isolation. I believe this is part 4, and this should be the last part. Basically, there's a couple of little additional mock functionality that I want to address. Call back and verify. Again, with what I'd given you previously, you probably could have completed the first assignment, the tire pressure gauge assignment. The second assignment, the copier, that's going to require a slightly more deep dive into a couple of related methods of the mock. So first of all, I want to go right back to where we left off. Right, here's my mock. Full name returns Bob Smith. I construct the mock object. I come in and we use setup in the mock to specify what particular method we're setting up. It is any int. Again, is kind of a wild card. That it class can allow you to control the proper values for parameters. And then you apply the dot operator. And so far, all we've actually set up on one of these mocks is what it returns. Okay, all we're doing here is saying when somebody calls get customer, it can take in any integer, but it's going to return a customer called Bob Smith. Okay, now what if we go back and take a look at how I handled the roll your own, right? The roll your own, when I did it myself, I modified it a little bit to do the second test. Rather than just having get customer return Bob Smith, I modified it so I added a customer variable to the roll your own class. I added functionality to add customer so I could pass in a customer, and then in the actual tests themselves, which are right here, okay, basically what I did is I called add customer to add that customer, and then down here when full name called get customer, it would return that. Now I don't really need to do that here at the mocks, right, because basically it's working fine as it is, and since I specify the returns within the test, I can actually come down here in the second test, Jane Doe, perfectly fine. But what if I wanted to take this approach that I did with the roll your own? Now, one of the reasons I'm having you do this as both, first of all, as the roll your own, and then later on as the mock, is that with the roll your own, you're kind of constructing a class. So you can come in here and you can add variables to that class for it to do its job. The copier exercise is going to require that your roll your own classes have some variables, and when you actually implement it as mocks, you're going to have those variables too. So the question is, where do those variables go? You can't actually add any variables to the mock. There's no functionality for me to come in here and say that this mock contains a customer reference. So what's going to happen is once you do it as the roll your own for all of these assignments and you establish that you need some variables for that particular object to do its job, what's going to happen over here in the mock is you're going to add those variables to the actual test itself. So notice what I'm doing is I'm coming in here and I'm adding that to the test, and I'm going to come in here and I'm going to, well, actually let's set it to null to start off with. Okay, so now I've got a customer variable, and when you do the same thing with the copier assignment, you're going to identify some variables the source and the destination need. When you do the roll your own, those variables will become members of the roll your own class, but when you do them as mocks, they become members of the test itself. And again, this is one of the reasons I have you do it both ways. I'm not just having you do that for busy work. Doing it as a roll your own is a more traditional programming approach. You figure out what it needs, and then you can go back and it makes doing it as the mocks a little bit easier. So just as I did with the roll your own, I now want to add some functionality to the add customer mock. Now I called setup here on get customer. You can actually call setup in as many methods as you need to. So I'm just going to come back in here to mock. I'm going to go back to setup. Only this time I'm going to tell it that what I'm going to be setting up is the add customer. So then I do X Come on. Oops, I'm sorry. Got my syntax wrong here. And add customer. Now add customer takes in a customer as a parameter, so I need to be able to specify that. Once again, I'm going to go ahead and use that it is any, and I'll specify that it is any instance of the customer class. And then I'll kind of add that wildcard there. Then what I want to do is go ahead, now add customer, right? Add customer returns void. So it's not the the return that I want to set up on it, right? Because it just returns void, so I don't need to worry about that. Instead, I need to add a more complex functionality to the add customer. I need to grab that parameter coming in, and I need to actually assign it to the local variable. Now, when you actually need your mock to do some work, again, returns is just specifying that it's returning something. But now what I want to do is specify that I want it to do some work when it gets called. So I'll come on down, and for that, we use this callback method of the mock. Now, callback is a standard, is a term applying to a way of getting old code to call new code. It's just a standard thing in programming, goes way beyond just mocks. But if you ever need old code to call new code, you give the old code a pointer to a particular function. Then in the future, somebody can rewrite that function, and all they have to do is make the pointer of the old code point to the new function, and that way you can get old code to call new code. So that's why they kind of use the term callback here, and we're going to, within this callback, specify what I want add customer to do. So I'm first of all going to come in. Once again, the syntax for mocks is quite unique. So once again, I recommend using that mock quick start cheat sheet to figure out what you're actually going to, or figure out quickly how to set up. And if I come in here, there's some setups. Okay, right there's an example of callback. Looks like some parameters, and then you come on in and you just do calls. Okay, looks a little bit different there, but let's go ahead and let's figure out, and you go on down further here, you'll see again some other variations of this particular thing. So let me go ahead and come on back, and what I want to do here is I want to specify that callback. Okay, and callback takes in a customer. So I'll do customer, I'll just call this one C. And then I'm going to go ahead and do this. And what I'm going to do with customer is make this variable right here, customer equal to C. Okay, compiler seems to like that. That should add this to customer. And I need to remember now that down here in the returns, right, what I wanted to return is simply this variable here, customer. So I'm just going to come on down here, modify that, and just have it return customer. Okay, with this little addition, right, at some point I need to call add customer. That's part of the setup process. So I'll actually come down here and add a line of code where I go back to the mock. And notice what I'm doing here is I'm calling add customer off of the mock. You can certainly do that. Mock object, add customer. And I'm going to send in a new customer. And this will be the new customer, Bob Smith. Okay, then down here, full name should return Bob Smith. In theory, since this has added it, make this point to it. Now, this is a case where I actually want to debug a little bit and actually see what's going on here. I'm going to put a breakpoint on here. Once again, you can debug into your code, your tests, but you need to use the debug up here under the test menu. So I'll do debug all tests and let it run to this point. Now, at this point, I've set up the mock, but I have not actually executed add customer. Whoops, What's the wrong? Test, run, debug, all tests. There we go. Took it a while. Okay, so here we are right there. Now, we haven't actually executed this line of code yet, so customer should be null. And when I check customer, sure enough, it is null, just as I originally set it. Now, after this line of code executes, customer should no longer be null. So I'm going to go ahead and F10, advance it one line. If it's working, customer should, and now customer is no longer null, and customer has a first name of Bob and a last name of Smith. So that's looking really good, looking like this test should go ahead and pass. So I'll let it go ahead and let's stop debugging. And let's come on back and let's actually run the tests over here in Test Explorer. Run selected tests, comes on in. Okay, now it failed. If I put the cursor selected and look down here, it's a vague null reference exception. Okay, object reference is not set to a reference. So what's the deal? We saw it actually set this up. Returns is just simply returning the customer, so why isn't this working? With that little debugging, we saw that our add was working, so the problem has to be with the return. So what's wrong with the returns? Now, as I've mentioned several times before, mocks are very sensitive to syntax things, syntax issues. Minor variations in the syntax will cause it not to work, but it will not produce an error that you can track down immediately, or it will not cause the compiler to fail to compile. So this is a good example of that, right? Okay, it seems to be working. We debugged. Everything looked good. What's wrong? So let's, again, I'm suggesting use this mock quick start sheet as a way to figure out what particularly might be going wrong. Now, the returns are discussed up here under methods. And we've already looked at this. They specify a returns there. That's a hard-coded return, just as similar to what we are doing. Now, down here, you'll notice some references to lazy evaluating return value. Okay, now look at the way the return is used here. Look at the way the return is used there. And look at the way the return is used here. Okay, access invocation arguments when returning a value. And down here, though, the syntax is a little bit different, and this is referring to lazy evaluation. Now, this lazy evaluation is a concept in computer science that says, look, rather than doing something right now, right this minute, what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait a little while, and I'm only going to need it when you require it, right? We generally look at that lazy. Generally, we think, go ahead and get everything done today, even if it's not needed till tomorrow. Well, lazy evaluation is saying, don't do it today. Wait until it's actually needed. So the actual problem, the error that's occurring here, has to do with the syntax I'm using is essentially a non-lazy evaluation. And so you can see again down here, when I'm setting up returns add customer, I'm just sending it the customer. So what the mock is doing is it's not being lazy about this. It's looking at the value of customer and deciding right now, this moment, on this line of code, what it's going to return. And right at this moment, on this line of code, customer is null. Okay, so with this line of code here and a non-lazy evaluation, the mock is saying, I'm always going to return null. I've already figured out what it is, so whenever you ask me again in the future, that's what I'm going to return. But if I want to modify this and change it to a non-lazy evaluation, notice the minor difference in the syntax, the parentheses, right? And so what that is going to do for the mock is say, look, be lazy. Don't decide right now what customer is. Wait until get customer gets called. And get customer finally gets called down here in full name. And between then, I've actually modified the value of this customer variable. The problem here, right, with the non-lazy evaluation is even though I've changed it, the mock just thinks it's going to return null because it was null up here. But if I modify the syntax a bit to be lazy evaluation, now what will happen is it's going to wait till the last minute. It's going to wait until it actually, full name actually calls add customer, and then it's going to evaluate the value of this variable and decide what to return. So the only requirement is that minor little change in syntax, and we can see that right here. Okay, so I just come on back and I will do that minor syntactical variation. And now we come on back and we run the test again. And now it should pass. And indeed, it does pass. So again, keep that in mind. A lazy and non-lazy evaluation is a programming thing. You'll find it in other areas besides mocks. But it always has to do with whether we should decide what something is now or should we wait until we actually need it and then analyze it and decide. And in this case, again, I'm using this to illustrate the fact that when you tackle some of these assignments, okay, use this mock and quick start cheat sheet, right? This was the syntax we were using. By looking at this, I established whether there's a different syntax. Even if I didn't realize what lazy meant, maybe I could look at this different syntax, give it a shot, and suddenly it starts working. Okay, so that is the callback method. So once again, when you need to do something, let's make this a little bit more complex. Let's say we have an integer called I, and we also want the callback to actually increment I. Now, in this case, I wanted to do two things. I wanted to take in the parameter add customer is what I'm setting up here and assign it to customer, and I wanted to increment I. Now, so far you've just seen me do this on one line, but when you actually tackle the final exam, some of the callbacks you're going to set up will require to do a little bit more. One of them should be required to throw an exception. So you can actually modify this a little bit to make the code a little bit more readable. It takes a bit of tinkering around, but if you play around with this a bit, you'll be able to get this in a situation where you can actually go ahead and set up, okay, and add multiple lines of code. Actually, I usually go ahead and just go ahead and do this. And then down here, I'm also going to increment that I. So do be aware you can have a callback execute more than one line of code. And I usually use the brackets here and set it up like this just because it makes it a little bit more readable. So in theory now, after add customer is called, then I should be 1. So let's just make sure that is the case. I'll come on up here, have it run all tests. And again, it's taking a little while. You'll notice the time, if you check the timing on the tests for the mocks, it takes some time for all these mock libraries to be loaded in. So you usually find that first test produces some problems. I did run it, didn't I? Run all tests. I don't want to run the test. I want to debug. I'm sorry. Debug all tests. Okay. So add customer was executed, and I should now be 1, and it is. So keep that in mind. You can have the callback basically execute highly complex code. If it's more than one line, I usually use the brackets and draw it out like this just because it makes it a little bit more readable. And that is something that you'll probably have to do on that final coding exam. Okay, there's one additional thing I want to deal with here, and that's there's a couple of tests on the final exam that don't really have to do with checking the values of things. At this point, pretty much all of our tests, right, have been checking values. The action is performed. We get a variable that indicates the success or failure of that action, and then inside the R equals, we check the state of that variable. We're basically checking state. But mocks will take it a little bit further, and they'll actually allow us to check execution, how things do something as opposed to just the state of variables. And if we come on back and take a look at the mock quick start and cheat sheet and scroll on down, there's a little section on verify, and this can be quite useful. This is going to test behavior. This is going to let us test that certain things are being called and actually how many times they're being called. So now we're testing behavior beyond just testing the state of variables. So this can really open up your testing, allow you not just to test the state of variables, but to test that methods are getting called, are they getting called the correct number of times, that kind of thing. So as a quick little demo of this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my customer database, and I'm going to add a little method down here. We'll just have it return a void. I'm just going to call it test method. This is merely for testing. Doesn't need any particular parameters. Now, as soon as I modified the interface there, okay, and I go ahead and build, my roll your own is no longer going to compile because I haven't added that. So just to make sure everything's cool, I'll come on down here and add test method to my roll your own. And it really doesn't need to do anything. Now that'll go ahead and compile. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to go back and in my actual customer manager down here when we call full name, I want it to also call test method. So I'll IDB interface, test method is right there, and we see that it's now getting called once. So now what I want to do is write a test that makes sure that is getting called once. So I'll come on back to my mock tests. I'll just go ahead and come on down here and use the Jane Doe one for this. That should work perfectly fine. And I'm going to rename this test to see that full name calls test method. So you'll notice again this is kind of distinctly different than what we have been doing where we've just been testing the states of things. Now we're going to actually test behavior. Now to use the verify basically replaces the assert. Okay, the success or failure of the test is now going to be based on that verify. And once again, I recommend please take advantage of this mock quick start cheat sheet. You can come down here and real quickly get a sense of the syntax you need to make verify work. So right inside here, I go to the mocked object. I want to call verify. And I want to specify, again, the particular object that I'm interested in verifying. So make note of the syntax of the particular method. I just always use X, although I certainly could use anything else. I want to verify basically that test method is getting called a particular number of times. Okay, and I'm going to come on in here. Oh yes, that's right, I'm sorry. Add the parenthesis there. And the second parameter to this is, as you can see here, this little interesting little times class, okay? And this will give me a number of different ways to check this. I could check that it's called at least a certain number of times. Notice that at least takes an integer. At least once. Okay, at most so many times. At most once. Between a certain range of times. Exactly a certain number of times. Never, not at all. Or once. Now in this case, once should be the ticket, right? because we can see over here it's only calling it once. So let's go ahead, build, run this test, and see what comes out. And yes, indeed, it does say that it's returning it. Now let's make sure. I'm going to come back and I'm going to actually comment out the code where full name is returning that. Let's come back, run the tests again, and now of course it should fail. And when it fails, I can come down and see here expected invocation on the mock once, but was 0 times. Okay. And you have a number of different values you can use here. Let's say that it's actually getting called twice. So I actually add 2 calls down here to text method. In that case, once should fail. So build should fail again. Run selected. And again, it fails, but this time, right, expected invocation on the mock once, but it was actually 2 times. So again, I've got other options here in this times. I can do exactly a certain number of times, and that takes an integer. So I'm telling it I expect it to call it exactly twice. And so now it should start passing again. And I come on in here, run selected, and there we go. Okay, so that is the verify. Once again, it allows you to test behavior rather than state. If you think about it, most of our tests throughout this entire class have been testing state, the state of variables, but this is distinctly different. We're testing behavior. Does the class behave in a certain way? Is it calling a particular method a certain number of times? Okay, now with the callback and with the verify, you should now be able to complete the second isolation assignment, which is that little compier class. That is going to be probably the most similar to what's actually going to be on the final coding exam. Well, I'll discuss that later. But anyway, with this, you should now be able to tackle that and should be getting close to achieving everything that you need in order to complete that final coding exam. So this should be the last of the isolation videos. I look forward to talking to you soon. Thanks, everybody.